Okay, so we're talking about conservation easements as a part of a private lands conservation biodiversity finance solution. And I've got some sort of front slides that talk about the solution in general terms to discuss the conditions under which they work, or the usual ways that one would use a conservation easement, and then I'll go into the specific case where we did a study here in Colorado that hopefully will illustrate some of those dimensions and help us to understand how to make a business case for conservation easements along the way. As Marco said, it should be on the order of 35 minutes, and then we'll have a bunch of time for questions. So this slide, we're talking about all the tools or all the mechanisms that go into a conservation easement program. So you've got a conservation easement regulation or policy, but then there are a lot of things going around it that also help to make it work. So in our case, we've got a lottery where public funds, voluntary private funds are going into a pool, and then those get turned around back into conservation of new money for conservation. We have differential taxation, where agricultural properties are taxed at a lower rate than commercial and residential properties in order to reduce speculation and also in order to maintain open rural lands in agricultural properties. So the incentives there are to keep things in agriculture or open lands if possible. There's a conservation easement tax credit that for the proportion of the easement or the value of the property that is being donated back to the public, and that easement or that credit is going to be transferable, because many farmers don't. Well, what we say is that you're land rich and you're cash poor, and so you don't get a lot of income, but you have a lot of wealth. And when you don't have a lot of income, you can't take advantage of a tax credit, income tax credit necessarily. So when you donate your easement, you get the value of the tax credit, then you can go ahead and sell that tax credit on a secondary market to people who have a high level of wealth. And so that's that next line. And then in addition to this, we also have here in the United States federal agricultural policy called the Farm Bill, which has 10 titles, and the second title is about conservation. In the conservation title, there are subsidies programs for maintaining agricultural lands in conservation practices, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But in essence, it is used as leverage locally. The federal funds are used as local leverage to enhance conservation programs that have been being implemented at the state or local level. And then the final thing is when these things are beneficial to the public, we need to make sure that we're communicating that. And so this analysis that we've done most recently takes a look at the return on investment to Coloradoans, so it's the state of Colorado within the 50 states of the U.S., for a state-level program that facilitates conservation of rural lands. And we have two different policies here, one based on that lottery and the other one based on tax credit. And of course, when you have a tax credit, for some people, that means the tax burden goes on everybody else. And so the Coloradans are interested to know that those monies that they did not collect in taxes are actually benefiting the public. So we use valuation tools and financial tools in order to do an estimate of that. If everybody's on board with that, we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, so what's a conservation easement? Conservation easement is a restriction placed on a piece of property to protect its associated resources. That is to say that we are going to separate the right to develop the land from the right to own it. And this is essential for a conservation easement to work, as long as you've got you're looking for private lands conservation tools. So we're allowing certain types of use of the land, but we are restricting other types of use of the land. When those uses are economically important, then the value of that land should probably go down, or should necessarily go down. So that restriction has economic value, and that's called the conservation easement. And that easement's value then is what we were trying to capture through any sort of a payment or a tax liability scheme. So it prevents development in perpetuity. If it were not in perpetuity, then we would, and there are some places where they are term easements, like California, for example. If they're not in perpetuity, then we still have this issue with speculation and people using the easement as a way to reduce their tax burden, and then they still hope to develop the land in the future. So in perpetuity is under federal law the way it needs to work. It encourages private stewardship of public values. That is, we're using typically public funds to change the incentives that landowners are facing in order to align them with public ecosystem service values. It's a voluntary program. If we wanted to make it mandatory, we could use something like zoning, for example. We say this, in most of Europe does this, where they say this is agricultural land. There's no payment in place for that. But here, private property rights are rather strong, so we have to encourage people to do things, and one way to do that is through a payment. So they were voluntarily donated or sold by the landowner. They protect the land for future generations, allowing private property rights, while allowing private property rights. And they're traditionally, as we were talking about here, are incentivized with tax breaks or subsidies. These programs, like most land use planning around the world, is done at the local government level or at the state level, but there are federal and state programs that help to incentivize that sort of land use planning. Next one, please. Okay, so an easement is in terms of the way we talk about the various tools and solutions available to us, it's a regulatory mechanism with voluntary participation. That regulatory mechanism, so it's a legal, it has to be legally codified that one can do this. But then we provide fiscal and market incentives in order to increase the amount of the attractiveness and the uptake of the tool. When we give a tax credit, then what we're doing is reducing the tax base. In return, we're hoping to not make mistakes, right? We are protecting the land, and as such, this is an avoided cost approach, and it's also a deliver better approach in that what we're trying to do is manipulate the incentives or adjust the incentives that individuals are facing, and targeting funds in a way that are leveraged such that we get an efficient conservation of the land. I mean, one of the other options is, of course, to buy the land, right? So the public could own these properties, but instead of doing that, we try to use somewhat less money in order to encourage the sort of stewardship we're asking for. The legal framework has to be on land use or on private property has to be this a bundle of sticks kind of approach, where property rights are separable. So the right to own can be separated from the right to develop, can be separated from water rights, can be basically anything that is a valuable attribute of the land can be separated out and bought and sold. This sort of property right is not particularly common around the world, but in part because you need a legal framework for it to function properly. But this is what we have here. So you may own an agricultural property, but you may not own any water rights to it, or you can separate your water rights from it and sell those. Similarly, mineral rights can be separated and sold. And in this case, we're talking about the right to develop the land as something other than agriculture is being sold or donated in a conservation easement. Each easement carries with it a management plan, and that management plan is held by a third party, typically a government, or by what we have here called a land trust, which is essentially an NGO that is in the business of monitoring conservation. So Nature Conservancy is a large owner or holder of conservation easements in the United States, for example, and also in Colorado. Some of the issues that we are concerned with this tool, or with this set of tools, so with the solution, is whether or not we have additionality. That is, were these lands already going to be conserved and we're simply just throwing money at it? Can we verify that we're getting biodiversity positive outcomes? How costly is the enforcement, and how big is the stick? What do you do when landowners are not actually complying with the management plan? And these are all concerns that folks have here and in other places where easements have been used. It's quite a common tool in the United States. It is perhaps among the most popular places for it is probably in Colorado, Pennsylvania is another place, New Jersey, and some others. The value of a conservation easement is based on the appraised value, the difference in the appraised value due to the easement. That is, how much economic value is being lost by the farmer or by the landowner due to imposing an easement on their property. So that means it's equal to the opportunity cost of the easement. This is done in order to ensure a least cost policy for the government. It does not capture the value to the public. In fact, what we're looking at here is what's the difference between the cost to the government and the value to the people. So often farmers and ranchers would prefer that they are compensated for the full value that they're providing for society, as if they were selling the value of apples and oranges. And the way that policy works is they are compensated for what they're giving up. Next. This private sectors that we're typically dealing with, the economic sectors are agriculture, forestry, and tourism. Primarily agriculture, but it can be the others. The public sectors that have interest in this are parks and protected areas. It depends on how your government works, of course. The Minister of Agriculture, Forestry, Environment, Water, Planning, Treasury, and Finance. These are should all be interested in this type of a program. When our study was presented to the government, we presented to the Division of Real Estate at the state level, as well as to the protected area. There's an Open Lands Commission, and then the Treasury was there as well. Next. On the benefit side, what sort of values are being generated? What sort of ecosystem services are being generated? Well, we have, this is a planning and zoning tool, essentially. So here in Colorado, where we're growing very quickly and getting increasingly wealthy, there are issues with urban sprawl. And one way to pull in urban sprawl is to make sure that the agricultural lands are not going to be converted to residential properties. Again, it's for zoning. So one way we have used this tool is to create separators between communities, to protect wildlife corridors or endangered species habitats, to increase the buffer zones of private lands. And when I put a map up here in a minute, you'll see that about 40% of the land in Colorado is publicly owned through the state and federal government, parks and protected areas. And 40% is a lot, right? And so the private lands then are often adjacent to public lands, and those private lands are often forest or agriculture. So in order to increase the conservation value of those lands, it sometimes behooves us to protect the lands that are adjacent to the public lands. So that's in buffer zones. Clearly, forest carbon would be a value. The view, we have the Rocky Mountains in the background here. Water quality and quantity, downstream effects of protecting lands upstream. Rural lifestyle. Colorado's known for its cowboys and such, so that still exists here, and that might be something that is attractive to a community to try to preserve. So there's value. If you do a Google search later and try to figure out what these things are, you might see them under the following acronyms. PDR is Payment for Development Right. PACE is Payment for Agricultural Conservation Easement. ASEP is the federal program, Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, under the Farm Bill. ALE is related to that. It's Agricultural Land Easement. TDR is Tradable Development Right, where we try to use the easements to move density from rural areas to urban areas. So you have a certain development density that's allowed, and if you'd like to have lower density in a rural area and try to have more infill in an urban area, you can construct a program that will allow transfer of that development density. FRPP is Farm and Ranchland Protection Program, which was a predecessor to ASEP. WRP is Wetlands Reserve Program. There's also Grasslands Reserve Program, and others that were Farm Bill programs that provided incentives for agricultural operators to protect land. The next is a link to Conservation International, or sorry, TNC's All About Conservation Easements as a nice primer on the tool, if you are so inclined. Thanks. Next one. So from here, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about this project, this study that Marco brought up, that specifically looks at the program in Colorado and provides a return on investment estimate that we then shared with the Colorado government. It was done at their request, and however, without their funding. So the funding actually came from the land trust community, Colorado Coalition of Land Trusts, who were interested to make sure that this program actually remains viable. I look at two different policies, the tax credit program and the Great Outdoors Colorado Lottery. Well, the Great Outdoors Colorado Trust, which is funded by the lottery. Those are a couple of typical pictures of Colorado. Well, they're nice pictures of Colorado, put it that way. I have several colleagues that help me with this. And Mike is a really fantastic GIS guru, and we have an organization within the university called the Colorado Natural Heritage Program that does mapping of natural values and land use, among other things. And so the economic estimate would not be possible without good ecological information. Next. For those who aren't familiar with the United States, a couple of maps. Colorado is in the central west of the United States, and it's also smack in the middle of the Rocky Mountains. So if you look at the map on the lower right, the greenish area are the mountains, and then the whitish area are the plains. And so we run right smack down the middle of the Continental Divide, and for the most part, those green areas are public land, and the white areas are private land. So anything that's got a pitch to it is owned by the government, and anything that's flat is pretty much owned by farmers. So it's about evenly distributed. I think it's 43% of the land is in farming, and 40% of the land is in public lands, and then the rest is where people live. Next. So we'll be talking about two different programs: Conservation Easement Tax Credit Program and the Great Outdoors Colorado Trust. Next. So the Easement Tax Credit Program was created in the year 2000, where landowners will donate conservation easement and claim a state income tax credit up to the value of what they are giving up on the land. There is a cap on that of $1.5 million per easement, and so sometimes the way it works is if they have a very large property, they'll roll it out annually in portions, so that 1.5 million can be every year for up until they manage to protect the entire property. In terms of accounting, what we're saying is the state is not going to get that tax revenue, and so that's the cost of the program. So there's no financial outlay. The incentive is not a payment; it's a tax credit. Excuse me. Over the lifetime of this program, that foregone revenue amounts to about $775 million, and it's been more or less on the order of $40 to $50 million per year in recent years. Next. Great Outdoors Colorado, or GOCO, Trust started in 1995 and has been quite active ever since. Its investments in conservation easements are through what are called bargain sales. A bargain sale is a tool that we use where a farmer or rancher will sell their easement at somewhat less than its value. So it's not donated, it's sold, but it's sold at a discount, and therefore a bargain sale. The portion of the sale that is the bargain, so suppose he's sold at 80% of the total value, the 20% then is a donation, and the 20% is subject to the tax credit program. The 80%, it would be the sale that the GOCO would come up with, the money the GOCO would come up with, and the 20% would fall under the tax credit program. From the federal government perspective, it also has to, it's the 20% that they're interested in, and they will provide a tax break as well. So GOCO's open space program requires a cash match to lever GOCO money. Usually it's between 25 and 50% from local or federal sources. So the federal ACEP program can be used to leverage GOCO funds. Also private sources and the like. So we have a great number of land trusts who are very active in this arena. Perhaps 15 or 20 that are very active, and some smaller ones that are localized. So this program has been about $280 million worth of investment since 1995, but its match, so its overall footprint, has been about $760 million, so about $1 billion program overall. Next. So, driven by fiscal responsibility, we have a state that tries to reduce the size of the government to the extent possible. All government programs are audited every 5 years, and the justification for their existence must be demonstrated publicly. So one of the things that we would do is to provide a return on investment to public policy in the case where the taxpayer is giving up money in order to get some sort of return. So that's what we're doing here. We've got 2.1 million acres of easements within the state of Colorado, where we have 66 million. Oh, we should do that in hectares, shouldn't I? Let's see. So about 700,000 hectares is 2.1 million. Is that right? Acres. Is that right, Marco?
I have absolutely no idea. It's the U.S. measures.
Okay, a hectare is 2.5 acres. So that'll tell you. You guys can do it in your heads. 2.5 hectares per acre. No, the other way around. 2.5 acres per hectare. There we go. So we've got about a total of 1 million hectares of eased lands that are eligible for tax credit. 2.1 million of them, 2.1 million acres of them have taken advantage of this credit. There are about 66 million acres in the state of Colorado, and again, about 40% of those are in private agricultural properties. So we need quantitative information about these incentives. So the state auditor asked us to, at the state's university, the auditor asked us to take a look at this and to see whether there's a public return on investment due to the tax credits and as well due to GOCO. Next. Thank you, Mark. So this is a map of the state and the places where the easements have been leveraged through these two programs. So the green ones are GOCO funded exclusively. The blue ones are the tax credit program, and the tax credit programs ones actually have some GOCO money usually, but because of the data, we were not able to separate them with perfect confidence, and so in some cases we have not double counting, but we do have some places where we can't separate the one from the other. Next. Now not every acre is the same, right? And you can see by the pictures that it's a fairly diverse, ecologically diverse state. The mapping that Mike and his crew have done has identified we have 5 different levels of crucial habitat, where level number 1 is areas that have endangered species and are crucial ecological zones. Maybe it's an area of high mean species abundance or something like that, and it goes down to 6, where the 6th one is actually like abandoned, toxic land. We have radioactive areas in the state as well. So what we were interested in is whether or not the program had actually targeted areas of high critical habitat. And so in the first column you have the habitat rank from 1 to 6 in declining order. Then in the second column we have the total number of acres that have been protected of those ranks, and summing to 2 million. And then in the third we have how much of that acreage actually exists in the state. So if you look at across row number 1, where we got highest habitat rank, we have 81,000 acres that have been protected out of the 850,000 total acres of that rank, so about 10% of the total areas. if you have a protection program that is supposed to protect public values, one would like to have high-level habitat protected at a greater rate than low-level habitat. So, in fact, in this case, we have crucial habitat rankings of 1, 2, and 3 are much higher than 4, 5, and 6, so this bodes well. Next. Marco, next one, please.
It should be on.
Ah, there we go. Okay, now I got it. Sorry, there's some delay at my side. So to look at these, what is actually being protected a little bit more in greater depth, you can see these some of these areas that have high conservation value are being tracked with the data that Mike and his shop are looking at. And we have the number of acres of these important areas that are being protected, and then those areas that are adjacent to conservation easements, as well as those that are actually being protected by the conservation easement program. Then the third column, or 1, 2, 3, fourth column, indicates the percentage of the private land acres or mileage that is conserved out of the total that have these attributes. So the first column indicates those areas of critical importance and breaks it out in more specificity. Next, please. Okay, so to do the economic analysis, the return on investment, what we did is we looked at some analyses that had been done previously in the state through the Trust for Public Land, where they had done a meta-analysis, economic evaluation technique, where you transfer values from other places and previous studies to the current study in order not to have to do the valuation, non-market valuation techniques specifically in this site. What that does is it helps us to get a ballpark estimate, is what we would say, or an approximate estimate, without having to do the valuation, and the valuation takes time and money that we don't necessarily have. Typically, the government wants to know more quickly than the university can generate primary information, and so what we use is the information that already exists. We're converting ecosystem services per acre, which into economic values per acre, and you know, if you've seen the Costanza analyses, that there are some benefits and costs to doing it that way. Per acre values, or economic values, aren't always well captured on a per acre basis, but this is what we have because of the way that the easements are done. We calculated net present value from 1995 through 2024, because remember, these are perpetual easements. We went to 2024 because of the planning horizon of the government. We looked at the actual values in real terms, so corrected nominal to real from 95 to 2017, and then we did a present value projection from 2017 to 2024. So we've got a variety of financial calculations that help to make this case. We looked at the present value, the net present value, the real return on investment, so not the nominal, but the real, and the real benefits and costs of these investments per acre, and did a benefit cost ratio. Each of these resonate in different ways to different kinds of decision makers, so we decided to do as many of the financial analyses as we were able to do. Did a sensitivity analysis like we do with the BIOFIN methodology, basically around a low, medium, and high value calculation. And we varied the ranges around the values, the per ecosystem service values based on what we found in the literature. Next, please. The literature on this is supportive. There's a number of studies out there that try to do something similar. On a per acre basis, the return on investment in Minnesota was 21 cents versus up to $5.28, depending on the quality of the acreage. Sergeant Michaud, this is Trust for Public Land, found a 6-to-1 ratio. Eric Glenn found an 8-to-1 ratio, and the Trust for Public Land found a return on investment of somewhere on the range of $4 to $11, depending on what state, what values, what ecosystems, and how much the program cost. So in general, these are the ranges that exist in the United States for such programs. The box at the bottom is how the calculations are done. Basically, it's benefits less costs over time and across ecosystem services. Next. We identified, or Michael and his crew identified 11 different types of, I don't see it yet. Marco, did you shift it? Here it goes. Thank you. 11 different types of ecosystem services. And you can see those in the first column, from wetland to forest to mixed scrub to agriculture and the like. The easements were placed against all of these different types of ecosystems. And you can see in the first column, the first numeric column, number of acres under the lottery. The number of acres under the tax credit program is the next, and then the final column is the sum of the two numeric ones before it. So we're summing up to about 2 million acres, and you can see lots of the acreages in Colorado are done in grasslands. This is ranching cattle ranching is a big industry here, and the grasslands cover a great proportion of the valley bottoms and the eastern plains. Next. So we took these values and then, or these ecosystem services, and defined them more closely, and then attempted to look in the literature to see what sorts of economic values had been derived for those 11 ecosystem service types. And we found, well, we looked to two sort of seminal studies that had been done over time. The Sergeant Michaud one in 2009, we brought those values up to 2017 numbers with dealing with inflation. And then we looked at a Trust for Public Land study that was published in 2016 and brought those up to 2017 numbers. You can see that there's a good deal of variation, and as a result, that puts people's minds, makes them question their validity. As a result, we estimated using both estimates, and then our third scenario was to use only the lowest values between those two studies. So, for example, for herbaceous wetland, we did the estimate using 902. We used it 1361 for the high end, and then for the overall low, we used 902. So going through for the low estimate, we did 902, 902, 447, 445, 445, 17, 98, like that. And so we get a overall low estimate, we get an overall average estimate, and we get an overall high estimate. Here's what these sum to. Re-estimating the 2009 version, we ended up with a present value of $13 billion and a net present value of $12.6 billion, so a return on investment of 12 to 1. Per acre benefits of $6,500. Real investment costs were $505, and so the benefit cost ratio 13 to 1. Even using the low estimates, we come up with a positive return on investment of between 4 to 1, and a real benefit per acre of about $2,600. So this is telling us that even if we're really, really, really wrong, the return on investment is going to be positive. We fully recognize that these are not precise measures or precise numbers, but we also know that the return is not zero. And so anything that we can do that is defensible, that allows us to get some values that are at least broadly accurate, helps us to make the business case. Next. So we found that the state incentive programs have invested about $1.1 billion in conservation easements since 1995. Residents of Colorado have received a return on that investment of somewhere on the order of $5 to $13 billion through the conservation easement program. So therefore, the return is between $4 and $12 of public benefit, public incentive, public benefit from private lands, where we've incentivized private land conservation and stewardship on behalf of the public. We find significant numbers of acres that have been protected under the program are protected, are high quality or high priority habitats that we have been prioritized by the state government for protection. And last slide. Next one. Thanks. So over the last quarter century, Colorado's publicly supported private lands conservation efforts have successfully protected ecologically important habitats and species, have provided substantial economic stimulus and returns to the residents of Colorado, and we see that our estimates are conservative in that we were restricted by the data, but also the economic analysis to do a sort of gross level first estimate, let's say, of the values that one might see from these lands. So we don't, for example, we didn't deal with supply and demand conditions. The fact that we're not creating any more land and that we have a growing and richer population, which both of those things should create greater value. We weren't able to do view sheds or tourism. Also, these would increase the values to society. So there are a number of things that we could do. All those things would make the numbers bigger. And with that, I think I can close and take any questions. Essentially, what we're looking at is a tool, conservation easement, that's wrapped around a whole bunch of different sorts of programs in order to make a biodiversity finance solution. Hopefully what I've done is reviewed how that tool can be used, under what conditions it is helpful, and then how one might go about estimating return on investment to using that type of finance solution. Thank you.